Good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement. Here at NKU, our office connects the campus and the community, and this lecture series, 6 and 6, is one of the ways we do that. Most of the lectures during this series involve our faculty talking to you and talking to the community about their research and creative activity. But for the past 15 years, we've had a guest from the Associated Press as part of the series as well. So first of all, I want to thank the AP for being our partner for all these years. And Adam Yeomans, hold your hand up there, who's based in Tennessee but services I guess all the Southeast now. It's an ever-expanding territory but Adam has help make this happen every year, and we're very appreciative of that. I also want to say thank you to the technical, the people with the cameras that you see here. They are students at NKU, mostly majoring in electronic media and broadcast, and they are part of Norse Media, which is a co-curricular activity where they are learning how to do this. And they've been with us beginning intensely when the pandemic began and the series became a virtual series. We are now learning how to do hybrid events. That's why we had a little bit of delay while we got everything functioning, but we have a virtual audience with us as well. So those of you who cannot be with us in person, thanks for being with us on the Zoom link. And you will be able to ask questions at the end if you just use the question function. At the bottom, we'll monitor those questions, and toward the end of our speaker's presentation, we'll have questions. If you're in the audience, you just raise your hand. And we have a fun little microphone. You can kind of see it sitting over there. It's blue, soft, and kind of like a square beach ball. You pass it around and speak into the mic. And that will also let the virtual audience hear your question. So when we get to that point, we'll have a little fun with the tossing mic. Our speaker tonight, Peter Prengaman, is based in Phoenix, soon to be based in New York City, and directing a team of journalists that now number, I think, 26 around the world. A year ago, the AP had 5 or 6 people covering climate issues, but decided that this is a significant issue that needs more attention and put a team together. So they're doing some fantastic work. You'll see samples of that tonight, but there also are some links, and we'll follow up and send you some of those so you can monitor this coverage. It really is some extraordinary work. What I think you're going to find out tonight, this is not just a story about storms and fire. It's about a lot of other things. It's including things that you might not immediately associate with the climate change story. It's about equity. It's about international relations, taxes, immigration, and also about the beauty of the earth and biodiversity. And AP is trying to cover all of those topics, very complex, but really compelling journalism and compelling reading. And so please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you, Mark. You guys hear me okay with this microphone? All right. Well, good evening. It's really nice to be with you here tonight. It's an honor for me in a lot of different ways. Not only do I get to speak about topics that I'm passionate about, climate change, biodiversity, green energy, but I also get to do it in the Midwest, where I went to college. I went to Wabash College, which is about 2.5 hours west of here, in a town called Crawfordsville, Indiana. And every year, with my fraternity, we would actually come to Cincinnati, and we would have like a riverboat sort of end of the year dance. So I've been in Cincinnati a few times on the Ohio River, and it was great. I love living in the Midwest, though the weather, not so much. But I like the weather a lot more in Phoenix. When I began thinking about tonight's presentation, initially I had a worry. I thought, oh my God, how am I going to talk about climate change for 45 minutes? Or better said, how am I going to keep you engaged, keep you from, wanting to pull out your phone and, start scrolling as we all do. Now, I know, university students are used to long-winded professors and sometimes long seminars and stuff, although, there are probably no such long-winded professors at Northern Kentucky University, right? But that was a joke. That was a joke. Yeah, no, okay. But in all seriousness, when I actually started putting this presentation together, I had a different worry. I thought to myself, oh my God, is 45 minutes enough? Really? Because there's so much that I want to tell you about climate change, about biodiversity, things that are happening to the earth, about green energies and kind of this massive transition that's happening, that I thought, oh wow, I actually don't have enough time. We could have, a whole course on climate change. Because climate change really intersects with every facet of life these days. It's really not just a science story or a health story anymore. I'm not sure it ever was just one of those things. But today it's a business story, it's a technology story, it's definitely a lifestyle story, it's a geopolitical story, an energy story. I can just kind of go on and on. There are so many facets of climate change. And if you take away one thing tonight, I would ask that it just be, whether you're here or the virtual audience, a willingness to really dig in to climate change stories, to let them seep in, whether it's a scientific story, a story on electric vehicles, a story on the international debate and negotiations that happen at Conference of Parties or COPs, because those stories as a whole, as you really dig in, will give you a really good sense of what's happening to the earth, and by extension, the people and the organisms, the living things that call it home. Before we get too far, I want to make clear that tonight I'm not here as a preacher, as a journalist, and particularly for the Associated Press. My team's role is to lay things out as objectively as possible, and let you decide as a reader. Not here to say this is what you should do, or you shouldn't eat this kind of thing, or here's how you should vote. None of that. That's not the role of AP. The role of AP is to present the world as it is, as much as we can, and then let readers decide. Let's level set just a bit. Some of the younger generations watching, I think, have a good sense of climate change because younger generations thinking about the future know that in 10 or 20 or 30 years, they're going to be raising kids and grandkids. And so you see some of the most forceful activists pushing for change from governments are younger generations. But I'm going to bet that some of you, even the younger generations, don't necessarily know that much about climate change. And that's okay. We all come to things at our own speed, and there's no time like the present to really start paying attention. So a little bit of level setting. What is climate change? In very simple terms, climate change is the slow warming of the Earth that happens from greenhouse gases going up into the atmosphere, interacting with the sun, and heating the planet. Now, there are several greenhouse gases, and some are released naturally, but really climate change is being driven by greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. And these come from the burning of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, coal. These are things that the world uses to power our lives. And these things are what's going up into the atmosphere and heating the planet. Now, some of you out there may be thinking, well, but I've heard, don't some people say climate change is a hoax? I mean, is it really happening? My answer to this is yes, it's really happening. And scientists have known probably for about 150 years at least, or had some idea that carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere heats the planet. And the last 40 or 50 years particularly, climate science has established this again and again and again and over and over and over with models and all kinds of tests. So while I said a little bit earlier, you won't hear me preaching, you also won't hear me falling into the sort of two-sidism of journalism, of like, or the three sides, or get everybody's point of view, like, oh, this person says this is happening, but this other person thinks it's a hoax. We're not doing that. AP's coverage of climate is based on the science, based on the very clear fact that we know what is happening. Just as if my phone, if I dropped it here, gravity would pull it to the ground, and nobody would doubt that, I hope. We know more and more greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere will heat the planet, and this causes disruptions, it causes problems. Let's get started. I want to start with a series of questions because I think it will help you kind of wrap your head around climate change, particularly if you're new to this topic. And I want you to think about these as we go, okay? Let's see. So the first one, why do tenths of a degree matter? If you read the news about climate change, people talk about 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, and what they want is to limit average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial times, which we'll say, for the sake here, the mid-1700s. Industrialization really gets started in the years after that. So just think about that. Why do tenths of a degree matter, okay? Because if you're an average person out there, maybe today it was 82 degrees and tomorrow it's 85, and what's a few degrees, much less a couple tenths of a degree? What problems are caused by rising seas? A really obvious one is land gets engulfed, right? Sea level rises, and it rises because, well, there's a lot of melting of glaciers, other things, and so the level rises, it engulfs land. This is a problem, right? And it's an obvious one, and it's an important one, but there are lots of other things, so I just plant that seed. What other problems are caused by rising seas? What is the whiplash effect? As we have more and more climate-driven disasters, terms like this are becoming more common. That whiplash effect, atmospheric rivers, maybe you guys have heard of atmospheric rivers. But what is the whiplash effect? Why do we see drought in some places for a long time and then floods right after that? How do those two things work together? All right, so those are the scientific questions, and some of these we're going to come back to at the end if we have some time and talk a little bit more about them. Now for some sort of existential questions for you to think about. What renewable energy has the most promise? We've all heard of solar, we've heard of wind, right? We've, of course, heard of nuclear energy, not a renewable energy, but an emissions-free energy. In your mind, have you thought about this? Like, what gives the most promise and why? This is something that policymakers think about a lot. It's something that we as journalists think about a lot, and the things that we're covering and looking at. This is one of my favorites. Can oil and gas companies be part of the green transition? Again, I'm not here as a preacher. I'm not saying what can be or should, but just laying out a very important question that policymakers themselves are really dealing with. Can oil and gas companies and countries be part of the green transition, the transition to renewable energies? They argue that they can, that they are investing millions, billions in green technologies, that they're cleaning up their own operations, and that they're central to the future. People on the other side of this think, well, but you're still doing the same thing. You're still extracting oil from the earth. You're still, sending that oil off to be burned, and that, causes global warming. But a really central question that comes up a lot at the international level. And then something that I really urge you all to think about is like, how do we combat this? If we know that greenhouse gases going up into the atmosphere heat the planet, and we know the heating of the planet is causing alterations in the earth, more extreme storms, longer droughts, longer burning wildfires, more powerful hurricanes, wetter hurricanes. If we know that, and we know that the solution, one of the solutions, is to lower emissions, what are the best things? Do we need real technological breakthroughs? Do we need overhaul of policy? Is this a lifestyle issue? One of the classes that I got to speak with in these couple of days, somebody asked about agriculture and eating meat and where that fit into contributing to climate change. So think about this. This is a really important question. All right, a few more questions, and then we're going to get into what we do of our coverage. So why should you care about climate change? Just, you know, and let's put aside some of the really, I don't know, platitude kind of answers about, well, it's our future, and I care about the planet. These things are great, but we probably need more for us to really care about climate change right now, today, and do stuff about it. So I have two answers here, and maybe I should have done this slide a little bit differently, put the question and then give you my answers. I'm giving you the question and my answers at the same time. The first is because climate change impacts so much of what we care about today. This is not in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, today. And because climate change is ultimately a story about people. And this is really important for my team. This is really important for the way that we think about what we're doing each day. So here are some ways that climate change impacts what we care about. Inequality, right? How many conversations have we had, important conversations, the last few years particularly, about inequality? This is one of the most unequal things in the world today, is climate change, how it impacts people. Immigration, migration, again, like how many stories, how many debates do we have about, just in the US, our border, the southern border, people coming, what to do with them, should they be sent back, Title 42, what's the future if you guys follow immigration? This is important around the world. Immigration, migration is a big, big topic. This is huge in climate. And then the economy. We're all interested in the economy, right? The economy is being really impacted by climate change. So let's go a little deeper on each one of these. Inequality. So we've done, and we're still doing a series at AP and our climate team on climate migration, where we're looking closely at people around the world who have been forced to move or feel like they have no choice but to move because of climate change. Here are two of the stories, and this gives you an idea of just how unequal this story can be. The family on the left is in Indonesia, part of Indonesia called Java, and they would like to move somewhere because rising seas have meant that now they have about 6 inches to a foot of water in their house every day, that they have to live with this. But they don't have any money to go anywhere. They don't have any money to put their house up on stilts. So they're stuck. That's that family there. On the right, this is a family in the US, in this picture. They're in Vermont. These folks lived in Northern California, and after many years of wildfires, if you guys have paid attention to the news, you know there are a lot of wildfires in the West. California is really the hardest hit. Wildfires are not caused by climate change, but they're exacerbated by climate change. Climate change makes the conditions worse. So after lots of wildfires, some years and some scares, they just said, you know what, enough. We don't want to be here anymore. We're going to move. So they looked closely at where they could go and find more of a safer place, and they picked a town in Vermont. They just picked up and moved. They got out their wallet and picked up and moved. Where the family on the left, they're not going anywhere. They have to live with this. Super unequal story. Migration, immigration, I mentioned this just a second ago, but a few more details. About 21 million people around the world each year are moving because of climate change. It's creating problems for countries within the countries when people move and they don't have resources to help them, and between countries. This particular story is about a family in India that moved from northern India and the Himalayas. They lost their home to flooding and then moved to southwest India. And this is a little girl who is in this family. This is a story that's just going to keep happening over and over and over as people get pushed to move. And it can be really impactful. The stories that we've done, we really try to focus on the people and go deep on their lives and what it means for them. In the case of this little girl, she had to learn a new language when she went to this new school. And she's doing okay with it. She was 8 when she started learning, but her brother, who's 10, is really struggling, even a few years later. He's really struggling to learn the new language. And then the economy. Every year there are many storms, many storms, and we'll just talk about the US. A lot that you never hear of, that just don't make the news, but are big weather events that cost billions of dollars to rebuild and confront. This is a huge thing, really, really a huge thing that's happening. And I think ultimately one of the things that may push countries around the world, a lot of countries are doing a lot to combat climate change, but I think one of the things that will push them to go even further is this, because billions are being spent every year in recovery from climate change. From storms. I should be clear though, because this is something that misinformation campaigns like to jump on. More people are not dying because of storms, because the world's gotten better at adapting and early warning systems and getting people safe, which is great. But the storms cost a lot of money. So while fewer people die than say in the 1950s from weather events, the price tag is in the trillions. We do stories, a couple every year, looking at the costs of climate change. All right, so if the world is heating up, and it's happening because of greenhouse gas emissions going into the world, the solution, not an easy thing to actually pull off, easier said than done, but is to decarbonize, right? To really lower a carbon footprint. So here are some possibilities of a decarbonized world that we also cover as part of our coverage. A cleaner environment, green jobs, and energy security. Let me talk a bit about each one. So a cleaner environment. This one means a lot to me when I first started really working on climate change stories. I've worked on climate change environment stories on and off my whole career. And I would often hear people say, well, we want the environment to be good for our children. We got to think about the future, those future generations. And I'm all about the future generations. I have 3 kids, 7, 11, and 13, and I want it to be a clean world for them. But I think if we focus too much on the future, we're not focused where we need to be, and that's the present. I want to live in a clean environment, right? I want to breathe clean air. I like to ski. I like to hike. I like to camp. So decarbonization, in addition to helping us not heat the planet as fast, has the potential for just cleaner air, cleaner everything. Green jobs. This might actually be particularly interesting for the students who are getting close to graduating. There are millions of jobs in green technologies and energies. Some are retraining. We've done stories, for example, on coal workers who have lost their jobs and because the plants are shutting down for one reason or another, and they're transitioning to work in like small nuclear reactors. There are a lot of groups that are really kind of pushing nuclear, which is its own real debate, and we look at that. But there are also, this is people being trained for turbines, wind turbines in the ocean. Millions and millions of jobs in these sectors. And I've spoken with a lot of people in industry, different companies that are struggling to find people who want to work in these jobs or even have the training and the knowledge to do that. So a lot of opportunities at different levels. And then energy security. This is a complicated one. I think the war in Ukraine has made us all think about energy security in different ways that Europe, US, we were too dependent on oil and gas from Russia. But it's not even about Russia. It's about being dependent on one source or a couple of sources. And so decarbonization provides opportunities to make countries, make individuals more independent from a lot of these things. You can't take away the sun. You can't take away the wind. Now, that's not to say that the wind or the sun at this particular moment can provide the amount of energy that the world needs quite yet, but those are things to think about. All right, so now I'm going to get you to the climate team. Mark talked a little bit about our buildup over the last year. About a year ago, we were 5 or 6 people at AP who covered climate and environment, and covered it well. We covered the international climate summits, the Conference of Parties. We did stories that made sense, from an environmental degradation standpoint. But it was under health and science. And so many of the stories really were through that lens. What really pushed AP was the thought that we needed to cover this much more holistically, that we couldn't just see this as a climate or as a health and science story. We needed to see this in a very holistic way. So we did. This is not our whole team, but this gives you a sense of who all we have. We will very soon be 26 full-time people. We're at 24 and 2 are being hired and will be onboarded here in the next couple of weeks. We have journalists in India, Kenya, the UK, Brazil, United States, Indonesia, Nigeria. Those are full-time folks that are part of our team. But then we also work with people all around the world. The AP, as you know, is based, well, everywhere. We try to be as many places as we can, and we have lots of strong journalists around the world, and our team works with them as well. We have editors for text, photos, video, collaborations. We also have some data journalists who are really good at analyzing data. We have a visualization artist who takes that data and puts that into ways that you can visualize. And we also have, within the team, a lot of specialization. We have people who are really good at green energy. We have people who've covered the environment for 20, 30 years and have a really deep sense of kind of where we are now compared to where we are today. And we have all ages and all races and nationalities and all over the place. Under the climate and environment umbrella, we have a small US water team, people focused on freshwater. We have somebody in St. Louis, somebody in Denver, and somebody in Washington who covers policy. And then we have an environmental beat team, which is kind of a compilation of people around the world who are interested in environmental stories. They don't, report to climate, but they do a lot of stories, and we work with them. So here are some of our priorities, and I'm going to go into some of these stories. So here's our news priorities, explanatory. I think this is really important, particularly because we have to be honest with ourselves. Like, a lot of the world is starting to learn about climate change, and we can't assume that people know things like why 1/10 of a degree matters. So we do a lot of explanatory stories that really try to meet people where they are and level set. We really try to capture impact. We've done this in big ways with our climate migration series, where we look at individuals and their decision to move or being forced to move. But we look at capturing impact in lots of other ways. And this is really important because to capture impact, you have to focus on people. And stories about people tend to get a lot more attention than straight, stories on science. Science is important, but you got to bring in the people. Energy transition solutions. This is a big focus for us this year. There have been enormous investments in green energy just in the last year. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration, but that's just in the US. Across the world, there have been many, many large investments in different green energies and technologies. So all of that is really accelerating a transition to green energy, and we're trying to capture that. Major policy decisions, when you really dig into climate change and the history and what moves the ball, policy is really important. And again, not saying it should be this or should be that. That for other people to decide, but policy is really important, and so we do a lot on that. And then holding to account. I don't know about you, but everybody these days is going green, right? I mean, everybody is net zero and carbon-free this, and some of that is very legit from companies that are really trying to do the right thing. Some of it is what we call greenwashing. So we do a good bit of that. But we're not just focused on stories. I'm going to get back to stories in a second, but we're not just focused on stories because I think the AP has an obligation to go beyond that, and my team and the AP think that too. So we also are focused on training, sharing climate knowledge with journalists in the AP and outside the AP. In the last year, we've had 3 different trainings, really trying to raise the level of people in the company because the more that you do that, the more that you talk about climate change and show people, the more engagement you have, and then the more you have, people in just random places who say, we did a story with somebody in Kuwait who, she wanted to do a story on climate change. She wrote us, we went back and forth, and we did. So we really tried to do that, and then this year we're starting to expand and trying to do some training outside the AP to really help people in the overall ecosystem feel more comfortable doing stories. We're also working to establish expertise through partnerships. Last year, we did a really big collaboration with 6 news organizations in the Western US around the Colorado River. At the end of last year was the 100th anniversary of the Colorado River Compact. So we used that as a vehicle to really look at the state of the river from many different perspectives. And we did, with these 6 news organizations, we did 11 different stories, one from each of the 7 states in the basin, and one from Mexico, where the Colorado River ends, and then from 2 tribal lands, because these are all the big players in the Colorado River. And if you paid attention to the news, you know that the Colorado River is really in trouble. The levels have plummeted the last several years to the point where hydropower is imperiled, a lot of species are imperiled, and there is no real agreement between the states on voluntary cuts, even though the government has, the federal government has pushed them towards it. So that's one. Just a couple weeks ago, I got back from India, from Kochi, India, where I and several members of our team worked with journalists from Press Trust of India, which is a large news organization in India. And we did 2 things. We did a workshop with them where we talked a lot about climate coverage and the things that we had learned. And then we worked with several of their journalists on stories that they're doing from the state of Kerala. And in April, we'll publish those stories. So again, it's another example of a collaboration where we're working with other news organizations and sharing knowledge and bolstering the overall journalism. And then the last I'll mention, on the climate team, a few of us, myself included, have relationships with philanthropies. The model of journalism, as you guys know, is not the same as it was 20 years ago. And a lot of journalism is being funded from philanthropies. And so the AP works with a handful of different philanthropies, and the climate change is part of that. We work with a handful of philanthropies. All right, so explanatory. Probably the biggest thing that we've done in the last year is a series called Climate Questions. And we came to this because we would get questions from readers, emails. I also, in conversations with customers, one of the things I do is meet with some of our biggest customers, learned that there was still a lot of confusion about climate change, about questions like, why does a tenth of a degree matter? And so we decided to take 10 of those questions and do some very simple, basic stories with animations. Animations are harder to show in a presentation. But we looked at things like, what's the problem? How much has changed? Who's most affected? And why do small changes matter? This was one story that we did. We backed up and looked at the basics. How did we get here? And how do we know gases trap heat? How do we know this is human-caused, right? Couldn't this have been just a natural thing? There is some natural warming, but we know this is human-caused. What are the sources, and who are the biggest emitters? What are the biggest industry, or the industries that are the biggest emitters, the biggest countries emitters? And then now what? Because we always want to think about solutions. Solutions are really important because while a lot of climate news can feel like doom and gloom, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some really great things happening, some really great entrepreneurs and people pushing the boundaries of technology. And then from a standpoint of readership, if all you present is doom and gloom, you're not going to keep reading, right? I mean, you've got to see hope, and there's a lot of hope. So we looked at this. What are the solutions? Can individuals make a difference? Is it too late? These are questions that we took on. Impact. This is the second of our really big ones. I mentioned the climate migration, and at the end I have links that I can send out or give to Mark to, for people to look at a lot more in depth in the things that I'm talking about here. This particular story came from Brazil. I don't know if anybody eat acai berries? Acai? Yeah? It's one of my favorites. I lived in Brazil for 3 years. I was a bureau chief. So this story talked about migrants or people who live and work in acai areas who are moving, and they're moving because as salt water goes up, it penetrates more of the land, and the trees that grow acai, even though they're not being engulfed, but there's more water, that's salt water that's coming to them, it's changing the taste of the berries. So in some parts of Brazil, they're having a hard time still selling acai in the same way. It's not growing the same, it tastes different. So this was a story that we did on that. We've also done quite a bit on Somalia. Somalia is a place where drought is devastating, killing thousands of people and forcing thousands to move. I really like this picture. Like that little kid's eyes tell me something, But again, capturing impact. This, I don't think I can make it play here without screwing everything up, so I won't show it to you, but again, I have the link afterwards. We did recently a very big story looking at a project in Mexico. It's called the Maya Train Project, which would put a train through the Yucatan Peninsula, where there is some really important jungle. And the story looked at, for the people there locally, it would mean more jobs and more development, and that's good. But it would also mean, more environmental destruction. And there's some very special species there. For example, a colony of about 3 million bats that may be impacted by this train. So we went and we did all formats on that. This was a favorite of mine. In southern France, drought, rising seas threaten traditions. This story focused on formal bullfighting in southern France, not bullfighting where the bull gets killed, in case anybody is worried out there. Not like the bullfights in Spain, but a different kind of bullfighting. And the story really focused on, you can see the level of the ocean there. How, again, more water comes, it engulfs some land, but more than that, the salinity causes problems. And so it's causing problems with the raising of bulls that are part of this tradition in southeastern France. This was also another favorite on these birds called ganets in Quebec. And the focus here was on how these birds, thousands of birds in this colony, are having to travel further and dive deeper to fish because of warming seas. And so the focus was, really on what that means for them and what that can mean for them long term. All right, solutions. Let's go through a few of these. This story we did on Brazil, and you can see there those fish. Those are actually fish. Those are huge fish that are in a part of the Amazon. And these fish, called the perucuru, were endangered for a long time, at least locally thought to be endangered because there was a lot of overfishing. And so people in these communities got together and said, we got to stop this. We need to really measure how many we're taking out of the water and make sure that these populations can thrive and exist. And so they did that, and the population, has rebounded. And then, as part of that, the people there learned that there was more than they could do with the fish than just kill them and eat them. That the actual fish skins could be used for boots, for purses. And so you see the story part 1 and part 2. The first part is looking at the people here, and then the second part of this series is looking at what is done with the fish skins, all the way to, we take you to New York, where you can buy a purse for $600 with these fish skins. So this really was, for us, a solution story, because people got together and said, we need to conserve these fish and let them rebound, but then we still need to make money, so what else can we do? We've done a lot on coral reefs. As probably many of you know, coral reefs have been just decimated a lot over the last, several years, but particularly the last decade. As sea level temperatures warm, and sea levels, by the way, are not, they're not going up quite as quickly as air temperature, but it's still enough that causes problems. And so you have the bleaching effect, where corals are just destroyed. So we've done a lot of stories of what different scientists are doing to try and help them rebound, because it's not just doom and gloom. There are a lot of people out there who are doing a lot of really good work, and we've been focused on them. We did a story recently from India on the way that farmers are trying to deal with land that has gone through some sort of desertification, gets drier, doesn't grow as well. But they're not just standing by and letting this stuff happen. They're, trying to make things better. So, again, a solution story. Policy, super important, because that's really what moves the ball. Personal decisions are important, but I think policy historically, of whatever it is really important to make changes. This was a story we did before COP27 in Egypt. If you remember, COP, it's like all the countries get together for international climate negotiations. We knew this particular thing was going to be a big deal, loss and damage. For those who don't know, loss and damage is the shorthand in international climate diplomacy for compensation. When you look historically at where emissions have come from, the vast majority have come from the United States, from Western countries, right, that went through industrialization. So the biggest problem, or the bigger problems, have been caused by countries like the United States, and poorer countries, developing countries, have contributed very little to the problem historically, because they just haven't gone through the same industrialization. They're part of it, but a smaller part of it. And so there is a growing feeling in international circles. It's been around for a long time, but it's come into a head, I think, now, that richer countries should compensate poorer countries for that historical damage. It's called loss and damage. This year at COP, they decided to, for the first time, create a fund for some kind of compensation mechanism. They still have to figure out how much exactly people are going to pay, who's going to pay, how you receive money. There's a lot to work out. But it was a really big deal for that to be recognized. And in it, like everything, becomes political. Some people call this reparations, right? Because there's some parallels to reparations. But countries like the United States really don't like to use that word. They'll acknowledge there should be compensation, there should be help, but they don't want to call it reparations. So we've done a lot on loss and damage, and we'll do a lot more because over this next year, they're going to be arguing and figuring out like how to make this actually work. We like to go deep with countries on what they're doing. In this story, we looked at where Bangladesh is. Bangladesh, as you probably know, is one of the hardest hit countries by climate change. A lot of the land is low-lying, so rising seas have engulfed a lot of the land. Has a very large population. It's still a poor country, so it's a very vulnerable country to climate change. But Bangladesh is also, like many countries, trying to move towards green energy. And so this story kind of looked at what they're doing with coal, still opening coal plants, but then also trying to counteract that with some of the green energy initiatives and investments that they have. We've done a lot on the Inflation Reduction Act in the last 6 months. Really important piece of legislation. Really encourage you to take some time and read about it if you haven't. And I say that just because we've done some stories on polls that ask people, what do you think Biden's done on climate? And a lot of people, even who support Biden, say, well, he hasn't done much. He hasn't done anything. He hasn't done enough. And this particular legislation is the biggest investment in U.S. history in clean energy. So from that standpoint, he's done a lot. But there are other pieces of this that we also focused on, like oil and gas industry, how they benefited too from the IRA. It wasn't just green energy, but oil and gas were able to get in clauses that they should be able to make bids on land for drilling. If you were going to offer land, for example, for a big solar farm or wind farm, that oil and gas companies should actually get to bid on that first. So we focused on that piece. Accountability. This is one of my favorite areas that I really focus on, particularly with one correspondent and one editor on our team, because I think this is really important. You don't want to, put people under microscopes or be unfair to companies that are trying to do the right thing and making transition. But there's a lot out there that just isn't legit. And I think we have to call out some of that and keep people honest. So I'll just talk about them briefly. The Prince William story, our correspondent looked at if you know Prince William, the environment's very important to him. And that's legit. You talk about the environment, it's important, I think, to the royal family in general. But looking closer, this correspondent in London realized that this Royal Foundation, Williams Foundation, was investing in some banks that invest a lot in fossil fuels. So it was just kind of laying out that disparity, right? If the environment's super important to you, then maybe you need to think about where you're investing. There are lots of funds that offer clean investment. In Peru, we looked at a tribe that argues that it was pushed off of its land for a carbon credit scheme. And carbon credit schemes are basically, the idea is that a company that, say, pollutes, will say, I don't know, X amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, can pay to offset that in, say, a forest where trees are being planted, because trees, as you know, absorb carbon dioxide. So this tribe argues that it was pushed off its land historically, and they haven't gotten any benefit from this particular carbon credit scheme. We also keep track of India, particularly. India, a big, important country in lots of ways, and particularly in climate. We have a reporter there who noticed that after Glasgow, after the COP summit a year and a half ago in Scotland, India had not updated its what are called nationally determined contributions, which is basically jargon for what India says it's going to do, what each country says it's going to do, to the UN. They hadn't updated it, and so he did a story asking kind of why, and soon after that, India did, in fact, update. We've done a couple of recent stories on Liberia and how there's a large forest in Liberia that's being illegally deforested. This same correspondent in London has been able to get documents and reports that show the deforestation is happening, that there's a lot of concern, and that the government may be involved. So that's been a really good story. And then at the bottom, we looked at banks that purport to really care about climate change and indigenous rights, and these are all part of their public profiles, the things that they say. But in this one case in Colombia, we found that several banks were still investing in an oil project there that was very problematic of labor issues and all kinds of stuff. So again, holding them accountable. Some things that we think about when we're planning our coverage, like how do you get to a climate story? What's that look like? Well, there are a couple things that you can do. Weather events are really big. This is a really great jumping off point for us to look at any number of issues, and people are being impacted. We cover the UN climate conferences, COPs, and at that time there's really a general increase in climate just because world leaders are talking about it. We're always asking ourselves, is there a climate angle to this news story? One thing that was interesting in India recently, I told you several members of the climate team went and worked with the Press Trust of India, several journalists from that news organization. Many said to us, we've covered all these stories, floods, droughts, all kinds of things, but we'd never thought of them as a climate story. It was just a weather story and a human interest story. So that was really great to hear, and we're always asking ourselves, what's the climate angle? How can we kind of see this through the climate lens, if it applies. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. And then there are a lot of standard news pegs, new reports, studies, different policy changes from governments. A few more things we think about broadly, the definition of climate. I said earlier that I think historically a lot of climate stories were seen through the lens of health and science, and we try to think much more broadly about them. How are people being impacted in any number of ways? Research, kind of an obvious one, but to really dig deep, what others have done, what policy papers are there out there, to really get a sense of stuff. And then always trying to think of a new way in the climate story. Today we had a story from a new reporter on our team who covers solutions, and the story focused on what laundry detergent companies are doing to reduce the jugs that they have for laundry detergent. That was a story hot off the presses today, because plastic is made, from oil and creates a lot of emissions, and then you have garbage, right? So a lot of companies are really trying to offer more dense, more concentrated formulas. So instead of this big jug, you can just have a little bag or something. Some other triggers, we talked about extreme weather, policy decisions, a company or country claims. You hear a lot of these around COP, countries saying, well, we're gonna go carbon neutral by 2060, or whatever it is. Water cooler musings, this is one that I really like. If people are talking about certain climate solutions, if people are saying, well, if I'm going to have a little garden, won't that help with the climate? We should do a story on that. Let's examine that. Let's see how great, a home garden is to help. I mean, spoiler alert, not much, but have your garden, enjoy it. And then environmental disasters. We've, covered up real recently the Palestine, right? I mean, the environmental disaster not too far from here. All kinds of things, oil spills, you name it, there's a lot. Other things that can trigger, an art exhibition. Maybe something is really innovative and cool. You could do a story around the start of a school, and I guess what I mean by this is like there are several universities that are increasingly focused on climate change and really building out departments focused on climate change. A really big one is right where I currently live in Phoenix at ASU. There's a really big interdisciplinary department that they're building. A new resort or development, particularly if they have claims about how green they are. We sent a correspondent to the World Cup last year, and her mission was to really look at the claims that Qatar and FIFA were making related to going, carbon neutral. And that, she found some things were really legit and some things were really questionable. A new movie, there's more and more movies about climate change, and these can sometimes be worth writing about. And then, of course, like release of new statistics. The last thing I want to talk about is just how we approach journalism. Well, I've been with AP 21 years in a lot of different roles. And when I started, AP was very much a text company. Text is still really important. I mean, we're still a text company, but we're also really a photo company and a video company, interactive graphics company. And so my approach has really changed to how we develop stories. In the old AP, when I first started, we'll say, the text reporter went out and did the story and worked with his or her editor, and they finished the story, and then they would just come and hand it to visual colleagues. At 21 years ago, we weren't even really doing video, not much, not like today, but we had photos, and so we'd hand it to them and maybe one graphics person, and it was sort of an order up thing. Well, how can you visualize this now? That approach is old, and really as a news director, I've evolved, and I think the AP is evolving, to lead with visuals. If you can lead with visuals and then build the text around it, you're going to have much more powerful stories. We did this here with, I talked a little bit about this story in Indonesia, about the people who couldn't go anywhere. This story started with the idea of portraits from people who are living in water. And so we had 10 portraits, just like this. That's what led the story. We added a reporter after the fact to build around, to write about these people and these images. Made for a very powerful story. I mean, to the point that we had a couple people from the UN reaching out to us, some NGOs wanting to know where these people were. I mean, it just really had a strong impact because of the visuals. The photo you can't see too well, but recently we teamed up with the religion department for a series of stories from Svalbard, Norway, looking at these mining towns and how life was changing because of climate change there. And the stories are just absolutely, the visuals are just absolutely stunning. And maybe if we have a little time, I can show you guys a little bit of those. But again, it starts with the visuals. That's where we're starting. And then we also think a lot about different versions of stories. It's not enough anymore to just do a print story, with photos and maybe a standard video. We have to be thinking about social media. We have to be, thinking about how we can reuse content. So on social media, we have different video cuts. We do some TikTok. We're there. Behind the scenes footage is important. Short and snappy cuts, photos, different arrangements for Instagram. Instagram's a really powerful tool. And just trying to always think of how do we do this, a little bit differently. Because on social media, you can get people to then link, click to the larger story. So we try to do that. To sum up, and Mark will get this to folks, just some AP resources that you can access to really follow climate. There are lots of great organizations out there doing lots of stuff, but I work for the AP, so I'm gonna, in my talk, push AP stuff. APnews.com We have an app. You can read it also on web pages. Really great resource for all of AP's stories. We have a couple of hubs. We call them hubs at AP that curate content. We have one on climate and environment, which is basically a running hub of all of our stories. Though sometimes it pulls in, because it's looking for like environmental things, so sometimes you'll go there and you'll see like a Dolphins, football game or something, because it saw the word dolphins and it pushes it in there. But it's a good resource for a running total of our stories. And then here's some of the series that we're working on. Climate migration. We've done 16 stories so far. The climate questions that I mentioned, and we're going to do another round of climate questions. The Colorado River collaboration, which I mentioned. The India collaboration will have its own hub, and those stories are going to start coming out in April. And then we're on Twitter. There's an AP Twitter, but there's also AP Climate Twitter, where again, a lot of these stories are posted and shared in different ways, several different times. I really, just in closing, want to urge people to pay attention to climate news and pay attention to the world around you. There are lots of things for us to think about, lots of things that are really important, but on that list should be climate, because it's not just the future of the planet, but really what's happening now that I think we need to be paying attention to. And as I said, the more that you dig into this, the more you realize that it intersects with so many facets of life. There's no such thing as just a climate story anymore. It crosses into so many parts of life. So thank you very much.
So please, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. Peter, for openers, I have a question from the virtual audience.
Sure.
Really, to some extent, you addressed this at the very beginning, but it has to do with typically journalists tell two sides of a story, but with climate change, the science has been clear for decades. Journalism gave too much credence, according to our questioner, to skeptics and their scientists. How do you reconcile the balance that journalists are taught to demonstrate with the outsized impact of giving too much credence to unfounded science or opinion, which in the case of climate change, perhaps delayed global action?
It's a good question. I think that, to be fair to journalists, I'll take a couple pieces of that. Did we give too much credence to the other side, to the skeptics, to the people who said it was a hoax, 10 years, 20 years ago? Climate science has evolved, and while things were pretty clear 20 years ago, they weren't as clear as they are today, and I think they just become more and more clear. So I cut past journalists a little bit of slack, because it's ingrained in us to want to look at all sides of things, and that's the right thing to do. But I think as the science has become more and more clear, it's clear that we don't have to do that. Like, we don't have to debate whether climate change is happening. We know it's happening. There's a lot that we can debate about climate change, what to do about it, What trade-offs are worthwhile and what are not. People get excited about, buying a Tesla or an EV, but the minerals that you need for that, have to be dug from the earth. And, that's a trade-off. And you have to kind of think about those things. And again, I'm not taking a side, but just saying there are lots of things to debate around climate change, of different technologies and what's going to work and how much we should invest and what should be the policies. But we don't need to debate whether it's happening, I guess is how I'd say that.
Questions from the audience?
I love this little ball thing, by the way. This is like so much better than bringing the microphone.
Or just talk into it. Wow, that's pretty cool. My question, I was interested when you were talking about the accountability piece.
Yeah.
I can imagine where you all are researching companies or governments, other entities, where it's not in their best interest if your stories are published. do you run into a lot of pushback or even find yourselves in dangerous situations or being threatened? And if you do, how do you combat that?
Yes, yes, it's a great question. No danger so far, but threats for sure, and a lot of pushback. The stories that this correspondent in London does, his name is Ed Davey, I've never seen get the level of attention from any other stories. Long before he even publishes a story, because he's talking to companies and asking questions, they reach out and try, in some cases, to stop the story. I mean, I've gotten emails from people who, I'm not a reporter, but I'm a public enough person. People find out who I am, and I've gotten emails from companies, trying to push him away from the story. Other editors at the AP have gotten emails from some of these companies. So they really pay attention, and in many cases, yeah, really try to derail a story or put it in a different light. And that's really good, actually, because then you see from their opening salvos like what their focus is, and it makes the story stronger anyway. So I encourage, think about it. It's in a good way, but there's definitely a lot of resistance to some of these stories. Yeah. Yeah, companies want to tell you that they're doing all these great things for the environment. Some of them are, but some of them are not.
Raise your hand. There we go. Toss hand.
Thank you. So, have you and the AP climate team ever run into topics or subjects under the climate and environment umbrella that just seem to not receive a lot of media attention or public attention in general?
That's a good question. Not in the year that I've been doing this. I think maybe earlier in my career when I would do some climate environment stories as a reporter and as an editor in different places, I would see stories that didn't get the kind of attention and impact that I thought that they should. But these days, I think our stories do get quite a bit of attention and a good bit of engagement. I think where we struggle, though, is some of these topics are really complicated. How do we explain to readers, for example, like how a carbon credit scheme works and why there are problems with it? I mentioned this earlier. Basically, a company pollutes in one place and pays to offset those emissions somewhere else by some kind of a project. We could do a seminar on carbon credits. So sometimes it's hard to take those to readers in a way that engages, because at the end of the day, it's a really dry kind of story. It's not. There are people involved, and you have to do that. But sometimes the topics are really complicated. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge for us.
Peter, I'm going to try to describe a story that your team did, and if you could, I hope, recognize enough of it to tell the audience a little more about it. But it was a story that impressed me a lot about drilling, and I think it was a contrast between Texas and Arizona and how the methane is burned off, and different state regulations that resulted in different levels of pollution. And it was rather impressive how much damage is done in almost a day from this drilling. Do you know what story I'm talking about?
Oh, I do. Yes. No. So this was a story focused on the Permian Basin, which is a really large area with a lot of oil and gas. And a reporter from the investigative team and a photographer went. It spent a couple of weeks with an infrared camera, basically trying to capture methane from a lot of different companies. And the stuff that they came away with was just kind of mind-boggling of how much methane is leaked, flared, burned off every day. And the real crux of it, and I think you were getting at this, Mark, was like there are regulations kind of all over the place. I mean, every state regulates things a little bit differently. There are federal laws, but how much those are enforced, a lot of that depends on the states. And in many cases, a lot of methane is burned off unnecessarily because it's just faster and easier for companies to do this. And so it just goes up into the atmosphere kind of unchecked. And as I said earlier, methane is one of the most powerful greenhouse gases. So yeah, that was a really good accountability story.
Companies are pushing to guide a story to a certain conclusion or guide you away from a story, and the apparent strength of climate change is a hoax, I would think the politics would be a huge place to have stories to explain that or explore that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely.
But, I mean, just the interest trade.
Yeah, no, and we do lots of stories on Washington, on policy, because it is a really rich area. What's interesting though is, I've paid attention to this pretty closely for a lot of years, and for a long time you could say that there was sort of a red-blue divide about this in very general terms, but Democrats will say believed climate change was real. I'm talking 5-10 years ago, and we should do things about it. A lot of Republicans said, not so sure. We don't need to do anything or shouldn't disrupt our lives and energy and stuff. I've seen that shift a lot in the last years, where you see it in polling, you see it in the statements that people make, where I don't think even in America there isn't that much of like climate change is a hoax. That's sometimes there, but it's more and more on the margins, and even conservative Republicans who maybe before were really against policy changes related to climate change are more open. I mean, we didn't see that actually in the IRA. That was really around partisan lines. But there's a growing awareness, I think, and sometimes Republicans don't always use the word climate change. They don't say that, but when they talk about things locally, they'll talk about a seawall or drainage systems or storm alerts or things like that are related to climate change. So that's a shift. In general, though, I'd say other parts of the world, Europe, maybe 10, 20 years in some ways ahead of like policy and thinking about climate change than the U.S. U.S. is really catching up. But in Europe 10 years ago, I think it would have been hard pressed to find really big groups that said climate change was a hoax, whereas there was a lot more of that in the U.S. In the last 10 years.
Peter, we have a question from the virtual audience. Let me give this to you just as it's asked. What specific action has your team taken which you believe has made the most significant impact with government and/or corporations?
That our team has taken? I think the thing that we've done that's had the most impact is just religiously, radically make climate stories about people, first and foremost, always about people. Who are the real people? Because that humanizes things in a way that I think gets policy, gets governments to listen, to think, to debate. I think that's been, really, really strong for us. It seems kind of an obvious thing to say, right? Journalism, stories about people. And on one hand it is, but on the other hand, I think historically a lot of climate stories have been very focused on the science, The science is really important, but if you don't focus on people, I think you're going to lose a lot of people. So that's something that we've done, I think. But, beyond that, we really, try to walk the line and be careful. We're not, the hope is not that, government does this or that's up to them. We lay out what there is and let readers decide.
So to both the in-person audience and the virtual audience, we're about to wrap up. So if you have a question, don't go home without asking it. Question from the virtual audience.
Okay.
What role do you think the environment and climate change will play in the 2024 presidential campaign?
I actually think it will have a central role in a couple of ways. The Inflation Reduction Act is pumping billions of dollars into the economy. You can just see, how things would work out politically. The Biden administration is of course going to look for impact on things that it thinks are, going well. The Republican, whoever that candidate is, you can see that person really trying to poke holes in the IRA and what didn't work and was, misspending, mismanagement, stuff like that. So I think that legislation will be a central piece. And then I think that as we have more storms and as we have more extreme weather events, that will become part of the conversation a lot more. So I think, I don't see climate change being, the central role of the election. There are lots of things that Americans think about and lots of things we should be thinking about. But I think climate change will be part of it for sure.
Tell us personally how you feel. There's a ticking clock. A lot of things are being done. People talk about past the tipping point. What do you think?
Of whether there's a tipping point?
Whether we're past that tipping point.
No, I don't think we're past that tipping point. I think that one thing we have to make clear, and actually I talked about this in the calculus class I went to today, is when we get to 1.5 degrees, when we get to 2 degrees, we're not going off a cliff somewhere. The world is not going to explode. But what we'll see is more and more alterations of the planet, of the climate, more and more extreme weather events and problems associated. So I think we have to remember that. That's important to not, lose hope ourselves about what the future. Have we reached a tipping point? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that a lot of things are being done, a lot of positive things that are trying to combat climate change. That said, emissions continue to go up. Despite a lot of good intentions and a lot of promises, emissions keep going up. We had a little bit of a lull during the first part of COVID. So that's, that's a bit alarming. But as a journalist, I have to be careful, of sharing opinions, but just with the straight question of, have we lost hope or are we at a tipping point? No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Yeah, right here. Do you find that the public is generally ahead of the policymakers in their attitudes and approaches to climate change? The problem, I think, is that our politics is so driven by money, and big fossil fuel companies have a lot of money to pour into campaigns and politics, and that kind of holds back the policymakers.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have actually come to that conclusion in the last year. I think if you had asked me a year or two ago, I would have said, no, politicians are really following what their constituents tell them and, doing whatever they think they need to do to get reelected. This is, how politics works. But I've seen some really interesting polls in the last year, particularly that the AP has done, looking at attitudes towards climate change, Republicans and Democrats, and you really take from that there is more acknowledgement of things that are happening and more sort of demands on a personal level that governments take action than is actually happening. So I do think there is a bit of a gap, in that. Oh.
Hello. Do you consider your part of your mission statement, for lack of a better word? I would say that AP is still considered by some people to be, quote, mainstream media. Do you think it's part of your goal to reach those people and try and change their minds or inform them better? Or do you think that you should, just put the information out there and hopefully they stumble upon it and believe it? Question mark?
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to reach everybody. I ask myself 3 questions and I share them with my team and we debate them and stuff. Who's not paying attention to climate news? Why are they not paying attention to climate news? and how can I engage? You know, how can I reach them? So a lot of what we do, whether it's things on social media, the climate question series that we do, I would even say this here tonight, talking to you guys, and I appreciate the time to be able to share this, and people watching the virtual audience to start, you know, thinking about climate change. Maybe you know a lot, maybe you're just learning, it doesn't matter. I want to reach people, you know. I want people to pay attention to this news. So everybody is potential audience for me and my team, you know. Sure.
So I don't really know how to phrase this question, but is there kind of like a game of Jenga? Is you know, you got that one thing that's making the whole thing stand up, but reversing that, is there one thing that you're watching that if it changed, if it was triggered, it would make the whole thing go better? Is it who gets elected U.S. president? Is it what happens at a COP conference? What thing happens that makes all of this go better?
I don't think there's any one thing. I honestly don't. I don't think there's any silver bullet. Our lives are very enmeshed with fossil fuels, and there's a reason for that. Fossil fuels are powerful. I mean, the energy that is in fossil fuels is undisputable. So I don't think, you know, we talk about it as like silver bullet. No silver bullet. I think that really combating climate change is going to take lots of solutions, policy solutions, you know, research and development, investment, technological breakthroughs, because all of these things combined, I think, can really move us towards fewer emissions. But there's no one thing, and that's why one of the questions I had was, you know, what do you think is the most promising green technology? It's worth thinking about. It's worth reading about, you know, there are different strengths and weaknesses of every solution.
So I'm going to ask the in-person audience to applaud especially loud, because the virtual audience is applauding, but we cannot hear them. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you. Been a lot
There will
of fun.
be a YouTube link to this, and we'll get that out to you as well as these links.
Yeah, I'll send you those.
And our final 6 at 6 lecture of the season will be April the 5th. We are going to be in a studio down in this building, but we do have some studio audience, so it's you can watch it virtually, but if you want to come in person, we have some room in the studio. And that topic is on artificial intelligence and creativity. It's kind of interesting, when we scheduled it, it wasn't in the news as much as it's been in the past few months, so it's gotten a lot more timely. And Nicholas Capruzio, who teaches here in the College of Informatics, will be our presenter. So join us on April the 5th, and if you have friends that you think should have come tonight and did not, they'll be able to watch it on YouTube. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. You guys are a great audience. Thank you.